jacked, and the warm brains come out the cracked skull of the back, as some of you are like pointing out. There's some pretty disturbing violence in this. This explains in many ways why we still celebrate violence and death so much in our culture. Why are zombies so popular in our video games? Why do we play so many video games that have a lot of violence? Don't blame it on postmodern culture. It goes back to these three texts. There is no question that if you want to resolve your conflicts, in the end, the way you do it is by sticking some kind of body part with a nasty weapon, or you do some kind of technology of some kind or another. Yes, it's been said in 303 many times. You want to explain the Great War, then go to these three poems, because in all three poems, war and killing is without question celebrated, and it's the primary means of conflict resolution. Or is it? Are these three poems suggesting that you got to find a better way to resolve conflict than killing, because in the end it only leads to more chaos? Is that the point of the end of the Odyssey when Athena says, enough? Is that the point of the end of the Iliad when Achilles turns over the dead body of Priam's son Hector to Priam? Is that the point at the end of the Aeneid when it finally has to come to its penultimate conclusion, and then Aeneas has to make his decision to kill Turnus or not, and the debate that will forever ensue about whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing to kill Turnus? Number two, we gotta say this out loud. These are texts by men, about men, for men, with a whole lot of women involved in really interesting and disturbing ways. What we will call the treatment of women question, and yes, feminist studies have been really important in saying to us from about the 19th century on, wait a minute, let's try and figure out how men and women relate to each other in this text, and then try to understand why it is the case that so regularly men and women treat each other the way they treat each other in real life. Do these stories have any kind of parlance? Do they have any kind of weight? I think they do. But I think there's a lot of questions about the role between men and women. The sacrifice of women. Agamemnon will kill his daughter Iphigenia. He cannot believe that when he gets home, Clytemnestra, his wife, is so fired up about that she would actually take his life. How dare he? But think about that. Why are we fighting at the walls of Troy? Because supposedly a woman named Helen went away back to Troy with a guy named Paris. Well, why did that even happen? Oh, because Paris, he chose Aphrodite over Athena and Hera. Well, why did he do that? Well, because she offered to him to sleep with the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, how come the other two women are so upset? Goddesses are so upset. Oh no, that's because, and then we're back to it again. In other words, we get pictures painted of women. Is it fair? Is it right? And what are the ripple effects? I think that's a compelling idea. Finally, number three. Well, we have called it the Theodicy question, the blame game question. And these poems are self-reflective about this. The opening lines of the Odyssey are a classic example of this. When Zeus is going to say, it is not our fault that humans have all this pain and suffering. Of course, the poem seems to suggest otherwise. And when, in the Aeneid, for example, you have Juno and Venus, Hera and Aphrodite, who are literally high-fiving each other to say, let's go ahead and jack Dido and just watch what happens. This is going to be a NASCAR wreck, and we're both going to watch it. They almost seem giddy about it at times. What is up with this? That is to say, do these texts lead, because remember, these were theological texts, right? Do these texts lead towards belief in the gods and theism, or do they rather lead to some kind of sense of atheism, or if not, certainly skepticism or a certain kind of fallibilism? To what degree are we going to get answers? Well, again, these questions that come up, I mean, how do you think of the gods? And again, as I said, I mean, this was already happening. Socrates right away began to ask questions about, do you really want to believe in a deity that's out there running around trying to hanky-panky with anything that will move? I mean, really? Which begs the obvious question, are we supposed to see these gods in their literal anthropomorphic fashion? Or are the poets in some ways making fun of the gods? So that, for example, when Aphrodite gets wounded, she comes back and cries and she's whining. I mean, these are like childlike deities who, however, can't understand humans. Athena cannot understand why Odysseus would be so upset about the fact that for 20 years he didn't get back home. She says, oh, I always knew you were going to get back home. He didn't know that. So she basically allowed for 20 years of his life to be taken away from him and Penelope and Telemachus and the Ithacan people. And it's just kind of frivolous to her. It's like, it's no big deal. Who cares? It's not a deal. Fascinating. By the way, of course, thinkers to come, I'm thinking now, of course, about St. Augustine, will pick up the religious texts of the Bible, and he will look at the sometimes anthropomorphic presentation of the God of that text, and he has got to balance that against the anthropomorphic stories of Zeus or Jove that he knows, of course, he doesn't believe in anymore once he reaches his conversion experience. Well, that's the first part of this lecture. The second part of our lecture quickly is I said this was a bridge lecture, to take us from those three classic texts now going forward. And every AP course is designed in its own way, and I think it's beautiful that it's designed that way. This is the way we design our course, right? Now that you know, if we can say it that way, your Homer and your Virgil, what is next? Our pedagogic intentionality now, I'm going to lay my cards out on the table for you. And of course, the course outline is provided for you, and it's right there. I mean, all you got to do is just hit learnstrong.net, go to the AP folder and click it, and there's the order of the text that we have studied and we will study, right? Going forward now, what's important? Well, our learning theory, as we've mentioned it many, many times, that ability to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. We always underline that because that's important. We do that in our annotative approach, in our annotative work at 3 levels. We ask 3 guiding questions, don't we? And we began every one of our lectures by reminding ourselves of this. At level 1, what does the text say? Summary. Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we divide 2A, themes, messages. 2B, rhetoric. Not what the poet says, but how the poet says it. Again, in our study of the 3 epic poems, we were looking at symbolism and irony, for example. We could have looked at a whole lot of other things, right? And then finally at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, how can I relate to stuff I've already known? And at 3B, how can I relate this to myself personally? So for example, we will ask for the rest of our time together in AP English about any text that we're studying. For example, we'll pick up Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and we will ask, what does the Iliad, what does the Odyssey, what does the Aeneid say about this text? Because this text, and Conrad's writing of this text, very much is informed by his study of those 3 poems and his knowledge of those 3 poems. So we'll play that game all the time. All right. So how do we play that game going forward? Well, let's just outline it quickly. Obviously, I could say a whole lot, and I'll fight the temptation to try and say too much about this, but I just want to get you a sense of where we're headed. Right away, we're going to go to Greek drama. In some ways, it makes sense. We've left the drama of the epic poems. Now we'll go to Greek drama itself. These dramatic texts were ones that Virgil knew well and included in the Aeneid. I made many comments about that along the way. We're going to start, though, with a famous essay, Aristotle's Poetics and some philosophy. And then we're going to go to Aeschylus's Oresteia, as we call it, the Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Furies. Then we'll do Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, hypercritical text for us, right? Then we're going to go to Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which is the text that Aristotle will celebrate in his Poetics, and then Antigone as well. We're going to go to Euripides next, the last of the 3 great tragic writers, traditions. And we're going to do, for Euripides, we're going to do his Hippolytus and the Bacchae. And you're going to want to circle the text Bacchae. I think it's one of the most important texts that we can read that is somehow a response to the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Then we'll do a single text of comedy, although we'll reference Aristophanes' Clouds, but we're going to look at frogs. And then after that, we're going to go to Aristotle's instructor, teacher, mentor, Plato, and Plato's instructor, Socrates. We're going to look at Apology, and we're going to look at Republic. Why? I include this in our study because I think it's foundational. We have to understand why, in the West, we learned how to become so critical of the stories. You notice how I say the stories we either accept or reject? Who taught us how to accept and reject a story? The answer is Aristotle, and the reason we have an Aristotle is because we have a Plato, and the reason we have a Plato is because we have a Socrates, and we're going to learn about it. And of course, his Apology, and more importantly even than that, we're going to have guided study through Republic. You have to know Republic if you're really going to be able to understand what happens in this thing we call Western culture. We'll also look then briefly at Machiavelli's Prince, because there's such an important element between the Thrasymachon argument at the end of Book 1 of Republic and Machiavelli's Prince. From there, we'll jump back to epics again. We're going to do the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're going to do the Beowulf epic, the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf epic, as well as the Exeter book. And we're going to look at 3 poems from the Exeter book, Seafarer, Wanderer, and Wife's Lament. Then we'll spend a few days with the Arthurian romance and Malory. We'll talk about Song of Roland for a while as well, and all of those famous medieval kind of epic poems. From there, we're going to go to our Chaucer and Canterbury Tales. We're going to look at the general prologue. We're going to look at the partner. We're going to look at the partner at the partner's tale, prologue and tale, and the wife of Bath's prologue and tale. And we're going to look at Chaucer's political iconoclastic attack on church hypocrisy, the patriarchy, and class nobility. In many ways, Chaucer is actually addressing the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. If you know those three texts, you'll appreciate what it is that he's doing. We'll also look, by the way, at Boccaccio's classic, Federico's Falcon. Boccaccio is going to be the influencer of so much of what Chaucer will do. Then we will meet what some, I'm going to say this throughout the rest of this lecture and of course throughout the rest of the year. Many scholars have said this is the most important text, whatever text we're talking about, okay? Some have said it's the Iliad, some have said it's the Odyssey, some have said it's the Aeneid. We'll say that about every one of these texts. Dante and Inferno. Now, Dante's Divine Commedia is in fact the entire poem, but we don't have the time to be able to work with all three parts, although we will do it in summary. But we will look specifically at his Inferno. T.S. Eliot said, the great poet that we will get to at the end of AP, T.S. Eliot said that all of the literary world basically is divided into Dante and Shakespeare, and there is no third. I think that's hyperbolic, and I think T.S. Eliot knew it when he said it, but nonetheless, Dante's important. From there, we'll go to our Shakespeare. We're going to have to talk about Shakespeare's histories, comedies, tragedies, and the value of Shakespeare as being sentinel. I mean, think about this. Dates that are simple and rounded. 1300 will be for us Dante. 1600, 300 years later, will be Shakespeare. And those are the two, Scylla and Charybdis, through which all of Western culture will sail. That's what T.S. Eliot said. You can't argue that position, by the way, until you've read all the texts. For Shakespeare, we'll look at Hamlet, Macbeth, Tempest, Lear, Much Ado, Othello, Midsummer Night's Dream, and Henry V. I wish we could do them all, we just don't have the time. Then we're going to look at Tom Stoppard's existentialist play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and some of you are going to say that's the funnest text that we do all year. I may be inclined to agree. Then we'll look at the Renaissance poets. We'll take a look at Spenser, at Sidney, at Marlowe, at Raleigh, Shakespeare's sonnets. We're going to study the structure and the power and the importance of sonnets. We'll look back at Petrarch for a while. We're going to do the King James Version of the Bible, the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, and we're going to ask, why is that such an important moment? 1611, I mean, if you want to study English, that's the pivotal moment. Why? Because that's the standardization in many ways of the orthography, the diction, the rhythms of the language, the King's English, as it's often referred to. We'll mess around next with the metaphysical poet John Donne. We'll take a look at Ben Jonson and a whole bunch of other poets, and then finally we'll get to Milton. And, I mean, it may be the case that when we hit Milton, we really are looking at the greatest writer of them all. Certainly in the English language, the argument has been made. We'll look at his sonnets, especially 7 and 19. Then we'll look at Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. What is it that makes great writers, great artists, great artists? I think it's two things. One, they subsume everything that came before in some kind of unique way. You can think of a Steven Spielberg, for example, as a classic exemplar of this. You can think of a Steve Jobs as a classic example of this, right? They subsume everything that came before them in some really creative way. And then secondly, they give us some sense of what's to come. They see the future before its time. And certainly, I will make the argument in detailed lectures of every book of Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained with you, that there is no question that Milton stands central in regards to doing that. And then we'll meet Bacon, we'll mess around with Swift and Pope and the Enlightenment thinkers. We'll talk about the differentiation of the value spheres and why that's so important, because at the moment we start talking about the Renaissance, we are talking as well about the burgeoning scientific movement that is soon to come, the age of reason and the differentiation of the value spheres. And why it's the case, why this afternoon when you go home, if you tell your folks, I've decided at college I'm going to major in poetry and I'm not going to do pre-med or I'm not going to do engineering anymore, they're going to have that funny look on their face. Why? They're going to get around to it. It's the same argument that, by the way, Dante's dad gave to him. If you're a poet, you'll never be remembered. You need to be a lawyer because you can make... Well, why is it the case that if you're an engineer major in college, pre-med major, you're going to make a lot more money than if you're a poet? Like, what is up with that? It begins during this Enlightenment when we have that differentiation of the value spheres and science begins to take over as the driving force of modernity in Western culture. From there, we will then pick up with 1800. We'll spend our time with the English Romantics. Last year, as junior students of American thought, we were also playing around with what was called the Transcendentalists of Emerson, Thoreau, and of course, Whitman and Dickens, and Dickens as well, Emily Dickinson. We're going to do, in this order, Burns, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge. Those are our Generation 1 Romantic poets, as we'll call them. And then our Generation 2 Romantic poets of Byron and Shelley and Keats. And by the time we finish that, we'll be ready to pick up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Remember that the full title, though, is not Frankenstein. The full title is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And at that moment, we're right back to the Promethean texts of the ancient Greeks. And, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey come to mind immediately. From there, we'll turn our focus to another really important epic. Some will argue it's the most important epic we study all year, Goethe's Faust. We're going to take a look at that, especially Faust 1. We'll talk a little about Faust 2, but primarily Faust Part 1. From there, we'll go to the Victorian writers of Tennyson, Browning. We'll do the Bronte sisters. We'll comment on Dickens. We'll do Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We'll do Golding's Lord of Flies. Think about that. We talk about Lord of Flies, and what is that novel really about? Well, it's about Jack, who likes to drop rocks on people's heads. Oh yeah, there was this cat named Hector and another cat named Aeneas that liked to do that as well. Drop rocks on Piggy's head. And of course, at the end of the novel, hurrah! Then the boys are all saved. Saved by who? By a military guy. Why is he around in the middle of the ocean? Oh, they're playing war games. I'm sorry, what are war games? Oh, that's how we practice dropping rocks on each other's... And we find ourselves going, oh, so in other words, conflict resolution is the same for adults as it is for kids. We like to drop rocks on each other's heads to resolve our conflicts. Where did we learn something like that? The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. Fascinating. Finally, we will meet the moderns. We'll have to spend our time with Yeats, and that will take us to T.S. Eliot. Many of you will argue by the end of our time together that we've spent all this time studying so that we can get to T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and the 4 quartets to follow. We're going to give guided lectures on all that stuff. We'll mess around with Virginia Woolf. We've got to talk about Virginia Woolf because there's so few women. Notice all of the males that I've been mentioning in this text. That influence of those 3 texts still is there. We'll talk about Tilly Olson's classic essay, Silences. And why is it that so few women are involved in our curriculum and in our conversations until the 19th and the 20th century? What is up with that? Is it because there were no female artists? No. No, Alice Walker will say it in Search of Our Mother's Gardens. She will say, they were always there, but they were usually anonymous. Or as Tilly Olson will say, they were just simply silenced because who runs the publishing houses? Virginia Woolf, Shakespeare's sister, and A Room of One's Own will be central to our study. Along with Joyce, we've got to talk about James Joyce. I mean, he's without question considered the greatest prose stylist of the 20th century in his Ulysses as well as Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. We'll have to meet D.H. Lawrence, of course, very influential. Kafka's Metamorphosis is the way that we will end, along with Tolstoy and the great Dostoevsky, the 2 Russian writers. About any one of these, I mean, I could say about any one of these writers, we are just at the epidermal level, really. We should be spending far more time with so many other thinkers and writers, and I haven't obviously listed all of them when I am going through this list, but those are the ones that we will spend our time with. Let me apologize in advance what I've already said to you many times, and that is, really, we don't have enough time to go deeper. I wish that we did. The rest of your life, you can keep reading, and that is the goal. The great Joseph Campbell used to hand out thousands and thousands of books on a reading list, waiting for a student to say, how do you expect us to read all of this in a semester or 2? And he would smile lovingly, as he always did, and say, you got the rest of your life. I would say to you as well, I hope you have the rest of your life. If I can do anything to help turn you on to reading these texts and engaging in these ideas, I hope that you will do it later in your life, because I can absolutely guarantee you that you will read every one of these texts differently when you hold your first child in your hand. And you will read these texts even differently, I can tell you from personal experience now, you will read these texts much differently when you hold your first grandchild in your hand. To that degree, I want to just remind you as well that if you've noticed, we don't have any American authors on this list. That's because we studied American authors in our junior year. That's the way our curriculum here at our high school does it. But we will make lots and lots of references. I mean, how can you read anything by T.S. Eliot, for example, and not reference Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, for example? The goal here is, of course, we want you to be ready for your AP exam in May, right? And so let's get to work right away. We're going to start, as we said, with Greek drama. We've already been messing with Greek drama in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And when we looked at Virgil's Aeneid, we know that we were messing around as well, paying attention, close attention to drama as well. And all of this is in many ways taking us towards, as we will say, St. Augustine, who in many ways, I believe, is the central figure that we have to pay attention to. So we're going to look at Augustine right before we do Dante. I think you have to, because Augustine is that bridge between the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, especially the Aeneid, and Dante's Inferno, and all of the legacy that Dante's Inferno will provide. But before we get there, let's start with Greek drama. And let's take Aristotle's Poetics now to heart. Let's learn what Aristotle has to say about what makes a great text. And why is it the case that we will go and look at a text, a film, a play, and we're moved in some profound way? Aristotle said there is a huge difference between you and your dog. You can both look at the sunset, but only you can appreciate. the sunset, not your dog. That notion of appreciation is what makes us fundamentally human, and ontologically speaking, that's why Aristotle said, you are special. You are special. And to that degree, you can enjoy this thing we call stories. That which we tell and retell. That which we accept or sometimes reject. I hope you'll come back, and I look forward to a semester and another semester of AP study with you. Thank you.